January 31st, 1944. The black waters of the Kwajalein Lagoon. It was a sea of ghosts. American ghosts waiting to be made. The United States Navy called it Operation Flintlock. The sailors on the transport ships packed tight in the suffocating heat below decks called it a suicide run. They knew what waited for them. Everyone knew. The Japanese had 5 years to fortify the atolls, to turn the pristine coral into a fortress. 5 years to sow the narrow lagoon passes with hundreds of Type 93 moored mines, a submerged garden of metallic death. Intelligence reports were grim. The files stamped top secret spoke of interlocking fields of fire, of coastal guns sighted on the only channels the deep draft warships could use. Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance, commander of the Fifth Fleet, knew the price. The plan was to pay it in blood and steel. Minesweepers would go first, clearing a path by absorbing the explosions. Destroyers would follow, then the battleships. The casualty estimates were staggering, a cost accepted, a butcher's bill waiting to be signed, but the massacre never happened. Not the way they planned it. The lead ships of the massive armada, destroyers like the USS Heermann and the USS Phelps, slipped through the Gaya and Melu passes with an impossible ghostly precision. They did not strike the mines. They did not drift into the kill zones of the shore batteries. The after-action report, a document thick with the dry language of naval bureaucracy, noted unexpected navigational fortune and praised the extraordinary luck of the lead elements. Luck. The word appears 12 times. A thin, inadequate word for a miracle. The official story solidified almost instantly. A triumph of American planning, American bravery, American luck. But rumors started. Rumors always start. They began as whispers on the mess decks, quiet questions asked in the dark. How did we miss the main minefields? How did we navigate channels that weren't on any chart? Someone said they saw something, a shadow on the water just before dawn. An outrigger canoe, another sailor insisted, slipping through the reefs as if it were part of the tide itself. A log entry from a junior officer on the U.S. Johnston noted unidentified small craft signaling with shielded light. The entry was later struck from the official record, overwritten by a captain's hand, floating debris. Debris does not signal. Debris does not lead. The paper trail in the National Archives is a dead end, a story carefully curated to celebrate a clean, conventional victory. No official report from Operation Flintlock mentions local assistance. No Marshallese name appears on any roster. No commendation was ever issued, but history is not only written on paper. On the islands of Abe and Mahuro, in the stories passed from one generation to the next, another history lives. It is a history spoken, not written, a history of men whose names are known only to their descendants. Men like a navigator they called Libjin, an elder from Kwajalein who knew the reef the way a man knows the lines on his own hand. He knew the secret paths, the safe roads in the water that shifted with the tide and the moon. He knew where the Japanese had laid their traps. He knew, and he chose a side. The archives hold the official story of American firepower. The atolls hold the secret one of ancestral knowledge and quiet courage. For 80 years, the two stories have run parallel, never touching. This is the space between them. November 26, 1943. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The maps were useless, worse than useless. They were lies printed on paper. For 20 years, the Marshall Islands had been a phantom zone, a forbidden kingdom sealed by the Japanese Empire. A black hole in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. No one knew what was there. Truly. Rumors existed. Whispers from merchant sailors who skirted the edges, stories of dredging, of concrete pouring, of airfields carved from coral. But they were just stories. Ghosts on the wind. The islands had a name in the dusty files of the League of Nations, the South Seas Mandate. A former German colony, a string of pearls scattered across the sea, given to Japan to administer after the Great War. A sacred trust. That was the term they used, sacred trust. Japan was forbidden to fortify them. A gentleman's agreement. But the gentlemen were all dead, buried in the mud of France, and Japan had its own ideas about trust. They bowed, they smiled, and they built. They built a fortress on the water. This was the Nanyo, the outer defense perimeter, a jagged 1,000-mile barrier reef of steel and concrete designed for one purpose: to bleed America white, to make any westward advance across the Pacific a suicidal nightmare of atoll hopping. Each island was a stinger: Kwajalein, Votia, Maluelap, Jaluit, Mili. The names were spoken in hushed tones in the planning rooms at Pearl Harbor. They were thorns on the vine, each one garrisoned, each one bristling with coastal defense guns, anti-aircraft batteries, and troops who had never known defeat. Troops who would die before they surrendered. The strategy was simple: lure the American fleet in, grind it down, one bloody island at a time. The Marshalls were the lock on the door to the empire, and Japan held the only key, or so they thought. Then came Tarawa, Betio, a speck in the Gilbert Islands just south of the Marshalls. The first test, the first violent knock on the door. It was a massacre. 1,069 dead Marines, 5,000 casualties in 76 hours. For a strip of sand you could walk across in 15 minutes. The photographs came back to Pearl. Shocking. The planners looked at them. They looked at the casualty reports, and they looked at the maps of the Marshalls with their dozens of Tarawas. They knew the old way would not work. It would break the Navy. It would break the country. A new plan was needed, a radical plan. The arguments in Admiral Nimitz's office were fierce. Voices were raised, fists hit tables. The old guard, the traditionalists, wanted to do it by the book. Start at the eastern edge of the Marshalls. Take Malolap and Wotja first, the slow, methodical, bloody grind. But a new idea was taking hold, an idea born of desperation and genius: leapfrogging. The word hung in the air of the smoke-filled room. Leapfrog. Why punch the fist when you can stab the heart? Why bleed on the outer rim when you can bypass it entirely? The target was audacious. Kwajalein Atoll, the largest coral atoll in the world. The administrative heart of the Japanese presence in the Marshalls. It was a jump of hundreds of miles into the unknown, leaving powerful enemy bases to wither on the vine behind them. It was madness. Or it was brilliant. No one knew which. The folder was called Operation Flintlock, a dry, sterile name for a plan of immense violence. They had learned from Tarawa. Oh, they had learned. The preliminary bombardment would be unprecedented. Not for hours, but for days. Battleships would close to point-blank range, their 16-inch guns turning bunkers into dust. An armada of new carrier aircraft, Hellcats and Avengers, would bomb and strafe until nothing moved. More amphibious tractors, more underwater demolition teams, more everything. They would not just knock on the door this time. They would take a sledgehammer and demolish the entire wall. And they would seize another atoll at the same time. A place called Majuro, a long shot. Intelligence suggested it was lightly defended, a gamble. And so they came. On January 31st, 1944, a fleet larger than any ever assembled. The Japanese garrisons on Malolap and Wotje watched it steam past them, helpless. They were bypassed, stranded. The main event was elsewhere. Kwajalein was pulverized. Roy Namur was turned into a smoking ruin. The battle was brutal but swift. The sledgehammer worked, and then came the surprise. A reconnaissance plane flew over Majuro. The pilot's report was radioed back in disbelief. Nothing. No guns, no troops. An empty anchorage, a perfect deep water lagoon, large enough to hold the entire U.S. Pacific Fleet. It was a gift from the gods of war, a ghost atoll, ready for the taking. The Seabees came ashore before the smoke cleared. They were the men who built the war, the construction battalions. They arrived with bulldozers, graders, and mountains of steel matting. They did not rest. They did not sleep. On the flattened islands of Kwajalein and Roy Namur they built airfields, docks, fuel tanks, repair depots, hospitals, barracks. A city of war rose from the coral. At Majuro, the fleet found its new home. A forward base 1,000 miles closer to Japan than Pearl Harbor. A safe harbor to lick its wounds and plan its next attack. On the wall in SINCPAC headquarters, a new map appeared, a vast chart of the Pacific. Before, the Marshalls had been a solid red block, an impenetrable barrier. Now, blue pins sprouted like mushrooms after a rainstorm. Kwajalein, Eniwetok, Majuro. The red flags on the bypassed atolls looked pathetic, isolated, useless. The black hole was gone. In its place was a highway, a superhighway. From the new airfields in the Marshalls, B-24 Liberators could now strike the great Japanese fortress of Truk in the Caroline Islands. The fleet, resupplied and repaired at Majuro, could project power even deeper into the enemy's heartland. The lock was broken. The door was kicked in. The Marshalls were no longer a shield for Japan. They were a spear for America. A spear aimed directly at the next line of islands on the map. The Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, Guam. They were just over the horizon, waiting. December 2nd, 1943. SINCPAC headquarters, Pearl Harbor. They weren't trying to win. Not really. That was the secret nobody wanted to believe. A nation of warriors who had forgotten how to win. Or maybe they had chosen not to. Chosen to die instead. To die hard? The strategy was called Yogeki Sakusen. Interception and attrition. A beautiful, deadly phrase. It meant they knew. They knew they could not hold the Marshalls, not against the full weight of the United States Navy. Not against the endless factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh. The numbers were wrong. The math was simple and brutal. So they changed the equation. The goal was not to hold Kwajalein or Eniwetok or Majuro. The goal was to make the Americans pay. Pay in blood for every inch of coral sand. Pay in ships for every mile of blue water. Delay. That was the real strategy. Delay the inevitable and make the cost so high, so impossibly high, that the American public would lose its stomach for the fight. 6,000 men. That's what Rear Admiral Manso Akiyama had. 6,000 men to defend an atoll the size of Rhode Island. An impossible task. He knew it. His superiors in Tokyo knew it. So they didn't ask him to defend. They asked him to die, and to take as many Americans with him as he could. The defenses were a spider's web. Thin, brittle, but perfectly placed. Spread out across the major islands of the Kwajalein Atoll, Roy, Namur, Kwajalein Island itself. They were not meant to stop a landing. They were meant to channel it, to funnel the landing craft into pre-sighted kill zones, a meat grinder built of palm logs, concrete, and Japanese steel. The intelligence reports coming into Nimitz's office painted a picture of desperation, not strength. Pillboxes made from 55-gallon drums filled with concrete, coconut logs for reinforcement, guns salvaged from wrecked ships. Everything was improvised, everything was makeshift, but it was deadly. A cornered rat is always deadly. The Japanese were a nation of cornered rats. And then there were the mines. The folder was thin. Stamped with a single red kanji, Mi, secret. It had been recovered from a captured fishing trawler off Tarawa. Inside, a sketch, hand-drawn, almost elegant in its simplicity. It was a diagram of a standard defensive layout for a lagoon entrance. It wasn't a fortress wall. It was a sieve, a deadly sieve. The title read, Shallows Obstruction Plan, Type B. It showed everything. The mines were not a solid field. That would be a waste. A foolish waste of resources they did not have. Instead, they were laid in strings, like pearls on a necklace, designed to be invisible from the air. There were the big Type 93 contact mines moored just below the surface, waiting for the hull of a destroyer or a transport. Horned devils, the sailors called them. Then, closer to shore, the anti-boat mines. Smaller. Set to go off with the impact of a Higgins boat. And on the beaches, hidden just under the sand, the anti-personnel mines. Little ceramic plates of death, almost impossible to detect. The diagram showed how these strings of mines were arranged. They created channels, safe passages. At least they looked safe. But the sketch showed something else. At the end of each channel on the shore, a series of red circles. One circle for a Type 92 heavy machine gun. Another for a 37mm anti-tank gun. A larger circle for a 75mm field piece, dug into a coral revetment and perfectly camouflaged. The channels were not passages, they were funnels. Funnels leading directly into the muzzles of waiting guns. The plan was to let the first few waves through, to make the Americans think they had found a clear path. And then, when the channel was full of landing craft, to open fire. From all sides. Annihilation. That's how it was supposed to work. A very good plan. A very Japanese plan. Patient? Devious? Cruel? The officers in Pearl Harbor studied it. Men like Commander Jasper Holmes, the intelligence genius from the station hypo basement. They traced the lines with their fingers. They saw the logic. The terrible, cold logic of it. The Japanese weren't building a wall to keep the Americans out. They were building a slaughterhouse to invite them in. Their entire defense was a lie. A welcome mat woven from high explosives. Suzuki, Sato, Takahashi, Ito, Watanabe, Yamamoto. The names of the dead already written in the margins. But the Americans had a different plan. Admiral Raymond Spruance had a different plan. He looked at the Japanese spider's web, and he decided to burn it, all of it, before a single Marine set foot on the sand. The strategy was called the Spruance haircut. A brutal, overwhelming application of force. They would not play the Japanese game. They would flip the table over. The bombardment began on January 29th. It was a thing of biblical proportions, a storm of steel and fire. The old battleships, the survivors of Pearl Harbor, were there. Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Maryland. Their 16-inch guns spoke with a voice of pure vengeance. Each shell weighed as much as a small car. They didn't just explode, they erased. They erased pillboxes, trenches, and the men inside them. Then came the cruisers. The destroyers. Firing thousands upon thousands of 5-inch shells. For 2 days, the islands of Roy, Namur, and Kwajalein disappeared under a cloud of smoke and pulverized coral. It was not a battle, it was an execution. The pilots from the carriers saw it from above. They saw the islands ripple and shake. Lieutenant Commander J.D. Jigdog. Ramage of the USS Enterprise said it looked like the surface was boiling. He led his dauntless dive bombers down through the flak, and they added their own contribution. 500-pound bombs. 1,000-pound bombs. They dropped them on gun positions, on command posts, on barracks. They dropped them until there was nothing left to drop them on. The Japanese plan for a battle of attrition on the beaches was being attrited from the air and the sea. The web was being torn apart before the fly ever got near it. The report stated that the minesweepers had cleared the channels. They swept the main lagoon entrance, finding and destroying 73 mines. 73 horned devils that would not claim an American ship. Victory seemed assured. The math had been recalculated. But war is not math, it is chaos. The Japanese strategy was delay, and delay has many fathers. The official maps were clean, the channels were green. Safe. But rumors trickled back from the minesweeper crews, whispers in the mess decks. They found things. Things that weren't in the captured documents. Things that shouldn't have been there. Mines made of wood, invisible to magnetic detectors. Mines with ceramic casings. Some were just oil drums packed with explosives and a simple pressure fuse, sunk in the shallows where no one expected them. The work of a desperate, clever enemy. An enemy who knew he was going to die and had nothing left to lose. And then the main thing started. On the morning of February 1st, 1944, the invasion began. The landing craft churned towards the shore, towards the beaches that had been pounded into dust. They moved through the swept channels, the safe channels. But the destroyer USS Anderson reported a violent underwater explosion off its port bow. No mine was supposed to be there. An hour later, the transport LST-48 shuddered to a halt, a plume of water and black smoke erupting from its side. It had hit something, something that was not on any chart, something that was not supposed to exist. The slaughterhouse door had been kicked in, but a few of the blades were still swinging. Wildly. In the dark. February 10th, 1944. USS Appalachian, off Kwajalein Atoll. The official history has no names. Not a single Marshallese name listed in the after-action reports for Operation Flintlock. They are ghosts. Phantoms on their own land. Captain James Corrigan, V Amphibious Corps Intelligence, knew the official history was a lie before it was even written. He held the reports in his hand. Thin. Too thin. The paper felt brittle, dishonest. The maps had been a joke, lines drawn by forgotten Japanese surveyors 20 years out of date. Useless, worse than useless. But the living knew the water. The living knew the reefs. They were shadows on the beaches of Roy Namur and Kwajalein Island. Figures in the smoke. The G2 reports called them natives. A single dismissive word. The initial assessments were brutal, apathetic, unreliable, starving, suffering from yaws, from tuberculosis, from years of Japanese neglect. That was the official story, the convenient story. But a starving man can still see. An old fisherman still knows the tide. He knows it better than any 22-year-old lieutenant from Nebraska with a brand new chronometer. He knows it in his bones. The Japanese had sown the lagoons with steel teeth, Type 93 moored mines, hundreds of them bobbing just beneath the surface, waiting for the steel hulls of the Higgins boats, waiting for American boys. The Navy sweepers did their work, methodical and slow, but the atolls were a maze. 1,000 square miles of water dotted with coral heads sharp as razors. Coral heads that never appeared on any chart. But the sea has its own language. A language of ripples, of watercolor, of the way the current breaks over something unseen. The Americans had charts. The Marshallese had generations. They had the sea in their blood. The stories started as whispers in the mess halls, on the fantails of destroyers after the fighting died down. Marines, mostly. 18-year-old kids from Ohio and Iowa who had seen something they couldn't explain. Something that wasn't in the briefing. A story about an old man on a bay. He hadn't spoken a word of English, not one. He just stood on the shore, watching the first LVT churn toward the beach, and he pointed. A calm, steady finger pointed away from their designated landing zone, pointed at the water's strange, dark color, at the place where the current broke wrong. The coxswain, a kid named Miller from South Boston, took a chance. He veered left. A minute later, a Japanese mine detonated exactly where they would have been. A geyser of black water and death. There were no records, no official reports, of course not. You don't file a report on a gesture. You don't commend a ghost for a pointed finger. How would it even read? At 09:14 hours, an unidentified native, description unknown, made an unspecified gesture, resulting in the preservation of landing vehicle tracked number 214 and its 14 occupants. It was absurd. It was impossible. It was a nod. A quiet word passed through a terrified translator who wasn't supposed to be there. Officially, they didn't exist. Officially, the landings were pure American genius and grit. Officially. But the stories exist. Not in dusty files in Arlington, Virginia. Not in the typed pages of the official war diaries. They live in the air. In the memories of the old. Stories told under the shade of breadfruit trees on Majuro. Stories of the giant gray canoes that came from the sunrise. Of the strange, pale men who did not know the sea. Who moved with a purpose that was both terrifying and clumsy. Men who did not understand the tides that could pull a ship to its death on the reef, or guide it through a hidden channel to safety. Men who needed to be shown. The cultural memory is long. Longer than paper, longer than war. The file for Operation Catchpole was thicker. The plan for Eniwetok Atoll. They learned from Kwajalein. They learned something. Buried deep in a preliminary intelligence brief, a single handwritten scrawl. From a marine observer, name redacted. Possible use of indigenous guides for channel marking. Just that. 6 words. It was crossed out. In thick red ink. Beside it, another hand. High risk, unreliable. SINCPAC directive forbids. That was the wall. The official wall. But rumors have a life of their own. They jump from ship to ship. They follow the supply lines. They whisper in the quiet moments before an invasion. No records, no documentation. Just stories. Stories of Marshallese fishermen in outrigger canoes, paddling out to meet the American ships in the dead of night. Away from the eyes of command, away from the official record. They say they drew maps in the sand. They say they pointed out the minefields the Japanese had forced them to lay. They say... Corrigan read the crossed outline again. Indigenous guides. The words buzzed in his head. He had heard the whispers from the Marines who came back from Roy Namur. He knew the official channels were a dead end, a wall of paper and regulations. So he went to the sick bay, to the makeshift holding area for Marshallese civilians evacuated from Kwajalein. They were being treated for malnutrition, for wounds, for fear. He found a young man, barely 20, thin as a reed. His name was Job. His family was from Eniwetok. He had escaped a Japanese labor crew 2 years before. He knew the channels of Eniwetok like the lines on his own hand. Corrigan offered him a can of peaches and a promise that was never written down. June 3rd, 1946, Kwajalein Atoll. They called it a test, a simple test. The newspapers in America called it Operation Crossroads, a scientific experiment to see what an atomic bomb does to a warship. A fleet of ghost ships was anchored in the lagoon at Bikini Atoll, not far from here. The USS Saratoga, the Nagato, the Prince Eugen. German ships, Japanese ships, American ships. A floating graveyard waiting for a second sun. The first test was scheduled for July, the second sun. For the Marshallese who had been moved from their homes on Bikini, it was not an experiment. It was an ending. Their world was being unmade for a photograph, for a line in a report. The war had ended, but the occupation had not. It simply changed uniforms. On Kwajalein, where Japanese bunkers were now just rubble for the vines to claim, a new city was rising. A perfectly American city. Quonset huts stood in neat rows, their corrugated steel skins shimmering under the relentless equatorial sun. Asphalt roads, black and sticky, were laid where paths of crushed coral had once been. Electric lights burned all night, a constant buzzing dawn that chased away the stars. There was a PX, a movie theater, a baseball diamond, concrete and wire, where coral and sand used to be, a new world built on the bones of the old. This was the legacy. Strategic denial, a forward operating base, a gas station in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, an unsinkable aircraft carrier paid for not in steel but in displaced lives. The Marshallese people were still there. Of course they were. Moved to the smaller, less desirable island of Ebeye, a crowded strip of sand a short boat ride away. They came across the lagoon in the mornings to work on the base. They built the Quonset huts. They cleaned the barracks. They served food in the mess halls. Their hands built the new world, but their names were not on any blueprints. The names were gone, just like in the after-action reports for Operation Flintlock. In the official histories of the Great Liberation, the Marshallese were scenery. They were background. They were statistics of displaced persons. The liberators stayed. The liberators became the new masters. They were kind masters, people said. They brought medicine and canned food. They did not carry swords, but they held the land. They held all the land. And the stories of the invasion? The stories of the guides, the pilots of the outrigger canoes who supposedly led the destroyers through the mines? They vanished. not from memory, from the conversation. The official story was clean. It was a story of American ingenuity, American firepower, American courage, a story of naval planners in Pearl Harbor and brave Marines hitting the beaches. There was no room in that story for a handful of native fishermen in a canoe. To admit their help was to admit a weakness, a vulnerability. It was to admit that the maps were truly blind, that the whole colossal enterprise could have been wrecked on a single uncharted reef. So the story was buried. It was buried under the asphalt roads and the concrete foundations of the new bases. The silence was deafening. The silence was policy. But the stories were still there. Not in reports, not in archives, in the wind. In the quiet conversations between elders, spoken in the soft cadences of the Marshallese language. A researcher came in the 70s, a young man from the University of Hawaii named Jacobson. He was looking for folklore. He carried a tape recorder and notebooks. He asked about creation myths, about the old ways of navigation. He found what he was looking for, but he also heard whispers, whispers of the war. They were not for him, not for the Ribalom, the white man, but he heard fragments, a name, Lojak, a place, the Taja Channel, a time, the night before the landings. He tried to ask directly. The old men would just smile. They would look out at the lagoon. They would say the war was a long time ago. A bad storm. The storm had passed, but Jacobson knew. The storm hadn't passed. It had just been given a new name. He spent 5 years trying to piece it together. 5 years of drinking coffee with elders who would talk about fishing, about weaving, about family, but who would fall silent when the word flintlock was spoken. They told him the papers were lies, not because they were wrong, because they were empty. The papers talked about ships, about planes, about bombs. They did not talk about the fear. They did not talk about watching the Japanese soldiers who had been their masters for 20 years, suddenly terrified. They did not talk about the choice, the impossible choice. Help the new invaders who bombed your islands from the sky? Or stay loyal to the old ones who would execute you for a misplaced word? There was no good answer. There was only survival. It was survival that was missing from the American reports. Survival and what it cost. Then a rumor, a story about a memoir. Not published, not even fully written down. The dictated words of Iroij Kabua, a chief on Kwajalein during the invasion. He had been old even then. He had seen the Germans come, then the Japanese, then the Americans. He had seen 3 empires wash over his home. They said he had told his story to his son in the late 1950s before he died. All of it. The Japanese demands, the American leaflets, the names of the men who went out in the canoes. The men who took the risk. The names that were in no report, on no memorial, in no history book. Schneider, Becker, Wagner, Kaufmann, Kleine, Gross. Those were the names of German trading companies from 100 years ago, names that had become part of the Marshallese language. The new names, the American names, were Nimitz, Spruance, Turner. But the real names, the ones that mattered that night, those were the ones Kabua had spoken, the Kabua manuscript. That's what a few hopeful academics called it. A ghost story for historians. Some said the son had written it all down on ledger paper and hidden it. Some said it was just a collection of tapes, slowly decaying in the tropical humidity. Jacobson looked for it. He asked everyone. The family denied it existed. It was dangerous, they said. The stories were for them, not for the world, not for the men who built bases on their land and tested bombs on their cousins. The manuscript became a legend, the final missing piece of the puzzle. The truth, they whispered, was in that manuscript. The real story of Kwajalein. And then the main thing started. A letter arrived for Jacobson years after he had given up. It was from a missionary, retired and living in Oregon. The letter was short. It said he remembered the chief's son. He remembered the ledger books. He thought he knew where they went. That's how it began. Again. The folder was in a missionary archive in Hawaii, the letter said. Or maybe it was burned. Or maybe, just maybe, it was still on the islands. Waiting. Waiting for someone to ask the right question. How does a nation thank the ghosts who saved it? How does it honor a debt it refuses to even acknowledge? A truth it buried before the ink on the peace treaty was dry? The official histories, etched in granite and printed in gold leaf, tell a story of singular American might, of destroyers and battleships, of overwhelming force. They speak of Operation Flintlock as a triumph of planning, a testament to an industrial power that crushed an empire. But the logbooks of the transport ships tell another story, one written in sweat and fear. The sailors knew. They called it a suicide run, a blind charge into the phantom zone the Japanese had held for 20 years, a sea sown with death. Captain James Corrigan knew it too. His classified intelligence memos, buried deep within the V Amphibious Corps archives, are a testament to a different kind of war. A war fought not with cannons, but with whispers. Not with radar, but with ancient knowledge. The real victory was not in the battle plans drawn up in Pearl Harbor. It was in the outrigger canoes that slipped out from the atolls under a moonless night. It was in the eyes of the Marshallese men who read the currents like a sacred text, who knew the secret paths through the gardens of steel and high explosives sown by the Japanese. Their names are not on any monument. Their reward was not a medal. History is a selective memory. It remembers the explosions. It forgets the silence that made them possible. It remembers the flag raised on the rubble of a bunker. It forgets the hands that guided the flagpole to the shore. For 2 decades, the islands were a forbidden kingdom. Then, in 1944, they became a battlefield. Today, they are a monument to a victory that was never fully earned. On the reclaimed earth of Kwajalein, where Japanese fortifications are now just skeletons for the jungle to consume, a new American city rose from the ashes. A city of antennas and launch pads. A city built on a foundation of forgotten trust. One empire fell. Another took its place. The currency of power simply changed hands. The Marshallese people traded one master for another, their reward a new kind of shadow. Not the shadow of an imperial Japanese mandate, the shadow of a footnote in a story they helped write. A story that was no longer their own. The truth remains, it persists. Somewhere between the lines of Corrigan's censored reports, between the archival files stamped "secret for a lifetime," between the silence of the elders who saw their world remade, then erased. It is a silence that has its own weight, a silence that speaks of promises unkept, a silence that echoes louder than any cannonade across the quiet, deep currents of the Pacific. They came as liberators, these young Americans, to free the islands from a brutal regime. They were guided through the darkness by men who knew the sea as their own soul. In return, America gave them a new world, a world of fallout, a world of forgetting. What is the true cost of a victory built on a borrowed, then buried truth? Perhaps we are not meant to know. Perhaps the story was never for us to tell. We search for heroes in the blinding light of victory parades. We forget the ones who mastered the darkness,